telling me the truth back in Baltimore, sir. Please continue now.
Well, I've read the case files, have you? Everything you need to find him is right there in those pages.
And tell me how.
First, principles, Clarice. Simplicity. Read Marcus Aurelius. Of each particular thing, ask, what is it in itself? What is its nature? What does he do, this man you seek?
He kills women.
No, that is incidental. What is the first and principal thing he does? What needs does he serve by killing?
Anger. Social acceptance and sexual frustrations.
No, he covets. That is his nature. And how do we begin to covet, Clarice? Do we seek out things to covet? Make an effort to answer now.
No. We just...
No, we begin by coveting what we see every day. Don't you feel eyes moving over your body, Clarice? And don't your eyes seek out the things you want?
What happens when you want to live someone else's life? It's a trap, you know. This desire to live someone else's life, you get caught in a trap of jealousy, and you get caught in a trap of envy. The Bible calls that coveting. What happens when you can't have what you want? When you look out, someone say, I want to look like they look like. I want to drive the car there. How come I can't live in the house they live in? What happens when you get caught in that trap? It's called coveting. It's what we're going to talk about a little bit today. And then the word comes from an ancient Hebrew word, shamad. And the literal meaning of it is the desire to possess something from your bowels. In other words, it's not just wanting. It's not just, hey, I like this thing. It says that there is something deep inside of me that wants to possess this thing. And it's in that desire to possess that we see the trap. Because guess what? In our desire to possess something that doesn't belong to us, it more often than not ends up possessing us. That thing becomes the center of our lives. That thing we are chasing after. That thing we are driving after. And our desire to possess something, it often possesses us, changes us, alters us into people that we weren't created or designed to be. And I get it, man. They've got a nice house. And I get it, man. I love that. It is. It's a nice looking bike. It's really cool. But there's a trap we get caught in when we covet. And we have to be very careful about this. Welcome to week 6 of Keep to the Code. It's the last week. We're going to wrap it up today. And during this series, we've been following along in the 10 Commandments, asking, hey, are they still worthwhile today? Do they still have meaning in our lives today? Do these things that were given more than 2,500 years ago, do these things really have meaning in a Christian's life today? And what we've uncovered as we've gone through this series is, in fact, they do. In fact, so much meaning that they set the foundation of the loving covenant relationship that we have with God, that they are still relevant to our lives today. And so we've been walking through those. If you've missed any weeks, I encourage you to go online at Radiant Online and look up at some of those past weeks and catch up as we go along the way. But this week we're talking about the 10th commandment, the last one. In that we go to Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, and it says this. It says, you shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female servant, his ox or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. Now, it's been a while since I have coveted my neighbor's ox and donkey. So I want to kind of bring this up into our times, our day and age a little bit. And so I'm going to look at this verse in another translation. I'm going to look at this in what I call the NJV, the New Jason version, okay? We're going to look at this verse in the New Jason version. And when we do that, we see that the verse, it says this. The verse opens up much like it says, don't covet your neighbor's house, to which I include, that also includes their lake house and their condo down in Florida as well too, right? It also says on there, don't covet your neighbor's spouse. I don't think I need to spell this one out for you, right? We already had the week on adultery and a few others, so I think we're pretty good on that one. It also says on that, or their cleaning service, okay? Because let's face it, we'd all like to have one, wouldn't we? Yeah, at my house, there's many times we're like, I could just use that one extra person here to clean up all this junk, man. But you know what? It just ain't in the budget. That's not it for us. But we're not supposed to covet that. It also says their SUV or their sports car, which is today's donkey and ox, all right? Just to bring that in modern times. Or their Harley Davidson, you pick. Basically, what he's saying is don't covet anything else that belongs to your neighbor. Don't covet their boat or their super huge, thin, ultra HD TV smartphone or even their awesome Pokemon suit. Because I saw some of you looking at me last week and you're like, he's rocking this thing, man. I get it. I get it. If you don't know what we're talking about, you might want to catch up on that. This commandment, this 10th commandment, is different than the other 9. That's why we're just going to focus on it a little bit today. The reason it's different than the other 9 is the other 9 are external, meaning they are things that you do. They are things that are visible. People can see these in your life. As we look back at the other ones, I worship God. I don't create idols. I don't use his name inappropriately. I honor the Sabbath. I obey my parents. I don't steal, I don't lie, I don't harm, I don't commit adultery. All of those things are outward visible signs. They're very clear. But when we get to this 10th one, the reality is I could be breaking this 10th one and you would have no idea. Why? Why do you say that? See, I could be doing it and you wouldn't know. And the reason is this one is different. This 10th commandment is internal. Which gets us to our first fill-in today, if you're going to follow along in your worship guide notes. The reason it's different is this. Coveting begins in the heart. Coveting starts here. And it's different than the other ones because of that. Jesus would talk to some people later in Matthew 15, and he would say this. In verse 18, he'd say, but the things that come out of a person's mouth come from the heart, and these things defile them. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murder, adultery, sexual immorality, theft, any of these sounding a little familiar in our series we've been in, false testimony, slander. These are what defile a person. And the last line was, but eating with unwashed hands does not defile them. I just included that in there for all of those who don't wash their hands after they go to bathroom. Jesus says it's totally okay, man. That's just right. Totally fine. Yeah, that's the NJV. No, actually, that's not what it means, and that's gross. Wash your hands after you go to bathroom, all right? Just FYI on that. Coveting starts in your heart. It starts here. And what they're saying is, what's in your heart results in your actions. That it starts here, the condition of your heart results in actions. And it begs to ask the question, what is the condition of your heart? What has your attention? What is it focused on? Because it does draw attention to our motives. While it may not be visible per se, as outwardly as some of the others, it does draw attention to your motives, and those motives ultimately end up in decisions you make and the results of what you do. And what I'm saying is this, coveting is about trajectory. Where are you pointed? What are you looking towards? And really your entire Christian walk is about this as well too. It's something that I want to talk more and more about in the coming weeks, your trajectory. Because what I like about that word trajectory is just this reality. You're not going to get everything right in your life, okay? We're not perfect. We all stumble in many different ways. Sometimes life looks like one step back, 3 steps forward. It happens. But what trajectory is about is it says, what are you pointed towards? What are you throwing your darts at? And when you look at someone's life over time, when you look back, is it a life where overall it was pointed towards God and His promises and what He had planned in your life? Or is it a path filled with debris, destruction, and death along the way? Is it a life of selfishness? And many of you probably know somebody, man, you look back in their life and it just seems like for whatever reason they have a road littered with debris. Where is your trajectory? What are you pointed towards? Coveting will show those motives. It will reveal those things in your heart. That's why the ancient rabbis actually used to say that the 10th commandment is the first commandment. Did you know that? They used to say the 10th commandment was the first. The reason why is because your heart is what results in your actions. Coveting leads to lots of different things, doesn't it? Coveting causes us to steal. Coveting causes us to lie. Coveting causes us to sleep with someone else's wife. Coveting causes us to come between God and the things we have, or to try to fill a God-sized hole with things other than God. Coveting starts in the heart, which leads to the actions. And what we end up finding is when we have this life where we covet, where we want to live someone else's life, where we have jealousy, where we have envy, we end up robbing ourselves. Coveting causes us to rob ourselves of the life God has in store. We say, well, what ways does it rob us? Well, the first way it robs us is it robs you of your contentment. A life of coveting will rob you of your contentment. You will never be satisfied. It's like having a thirst that you can never quench. You're never satisfied with who you are and where God put you. I love this verse from Paul in Philippians 4:11. He says, I have learned to be content with whatever the circumstances. So let me ask you something. Are you content with where God has you and where He has placed you? This isn't, hey, I want to raise the bar. That's different. Raising the bar is all about becoming the person that God created you to be, about becoming more Christ-like in your life. What I'm talking about is when you want to live someone else's life, God's plan for someone else, when you want to own the things that have been set aside for them. When you feel like you have somehow been treated unfairly because someone has something you don't. What happens, we get in that trap, is that we don't have contentment. Instead of focused on God, we're trying to keep up with the crowd. What's interesting about that verse from Paul is he wrote that from prison. I will be content in any situation God has placed me. The second thing coveting does is it robs you of your generosity. It will. And we were created to be generous people because we worship a generous God. But it's another trap we get in because, see, now we got to try to keep up with the Joneses. Or we have those funny things like, hey, person with the most toys wins, right? And we're in that compare-contrast game, trying to outdo it. Yeah, my neighbor's got a boat, but mine's 30 feet longer, baby, with 1,000 horsepower. It'll blow your toupee right off. We get in a trap. And what happens is we get in this fear and this anxiety mode. Do I ever have enough? Am I ever going to be good enough? Are they going to be impressed with me? Am I ever going to arrive? And we end up hoarding. And we end up holding back. And as a result, we fail to hear the cries of the oppressed around us. We fail to see the need. We fail to understand that God gives so that we give. It's a trap. Jesus had a conversation with some people in Matthew chapter 6. Verse 19, he says, do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth, where moths and vermin destroy, and where thieves break in and steal. Jesus is saying, this stuff's just junk, man. It rots. It goes away. Don't store up stuff that rots. Don't store up stuff. That's not really of value. And by the way, Jesus talked about money more than just about anything else. And relax, take a deep breath. This is not a tithing sermon, okay? We're not talking about giving. We're talking about generosity. What Jesus has to say at the second part of that verse is so important. He says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. See, we just get in that trap of having to own stuff and having to get more and more and more. And what we find out is as we try to own more, ultimately what happens is it ends up owning us. It's a trap. What does it look like to be content? What does it look like to be generous people? And notice what Jesus says in there. He says, for where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. He doesn't say where your heart is, your treasure will follow. He says where your treasure is, your heart will follow it. There's a big difference. And so I have to ask you, where's your treasure? What is your heart following? What are you pursuing? What is it you're going after? Is it God, His plans, His purposes for your life? Or is it stuff? Stuff that rots, stuff that decays, stuff that goes away. Because this much we know, we serve a generous, generous God. We've talked about this before. How generous is God? Most of us know John 3:16. For God so loved the world, He what? Yeah. One more time, read it. For God so loved the world, He? Yeah. God loved us so much, He gave His one and only Son. That whosoever believes will not perish, but have everlasting life. And we are called to be generous as well. We have been given to give. But when we covet, when we're jealous, when we envy others, we rob ourselves of the generosity that we've been given. The last thing is this: coveting robs us of our joy. It will rob you of your joy, and joy is founded on faith, and faith is trust and believing in God. It's believing that God has you right where He wants you when He wants you there, and trusting that God's purposes are better than your purposes or what you think your purposes are supposed to be in life. Faith demands that we trust God in any circumstance, like Paul talked about before. We're called to live life of faith. But as we look at this word joy, we also understand that it's made from two Greek words, and this is so important. The first Greek word is defined as rejoicing. The second one is grace. Those two words are put together, and so what a New Testament understanding of what joy truly is it means you are rejoicing in God's grace. True joy comes from a life that rejoices in God's grace, His mercy, His kindness. And here's what I know about grace. Grace is all about setting people free. Grace is all about freedom. And what we're saying is this: maybe you have this burden of feeling like, I'm just not good enough, or I'm a failure, or I'm just trapped in mediocrity. But God wants to set you free from that. God doesn't want you to live that life. He wants to set you free from that. And what we find out is coveting asks us and forces us to ask ourselves one huge, very important question. And that question is this: what's robbing you of your freedom? What is robbing you of your freedom? In other words, what do you need to be set free from? What has your attention? Where is your treasure? What is your trajectory? Is there something in your life robbing you of your freedom that's keeping you from being contented, from being generous, and from being a joyful person? Because here's the big point I need you to take away with today. The big one, the big idea. And that's this. If your heart is in the right place, you will not want to live someone else's life. Do you hear me on that? In fact, there was a time at Radiant when you'd say amen to that. All right, talk to me now. I'm from the South, all right? Pastors down there keep you an extra hour or two for not doing that, all right? When your heart is in the right place, you will not want to live someone else's life. How's your heart? Where's your trajectory? We have to be enthralled instead with the life that God gives us. That's why it's the 10th commandment. Get this one right, and the other ones just have a way of kind of working themselves out. Because coveting starts in the heart. Now let's turn the corner just a little bit. It's time to wrap up this series. Work through what is the big idea? What's the big takeaway in this series? Keep to the code. We're going to march through that here in just the next few minutes. It starts with a story where Jesus gets asked an important question. So if you have your Bibles, your electronic device, I encourage you to turn to Matthew 22. It's in your worship guide. It'll be on the screen as well too. In Matthew 22, starting at verse 34, it says this. The Pharisees got together, and one of them, an expert in the law, tested him with this question. Teacher, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Now, some quick notes. Some of you may know this story, but maybe you're new to Christianity, maybe you're new to faith, maybe you're new here to Radiant, and we're glad to have you. So glad that you're here. What's going on to set the stage here? This group of people called the Pharisees, the reason they're confronting Jesus is they're trying to trick him. They're trying to get him to stumble, to say something he's not supposed to say so they can prove that this man isn't really the Son of God. He isn't who he claims and his followers claim him to be. They're not there to hear a great talk from him. They're there to trick him. Now it says that they sent an expert of the law. Now in our culture today, we have a name for people who are experts in the law, or at least we hope they're experts in the law. Anybody idea what those persons are called? Lawyers. Yeah. It's funny because we're always like, oh, that's 2,000 years ago. Things have changed a lot. Nope, they haven't changed all that much. What happens when you don't get the answer you want and you want to try to get this person and you're mad at them? Sick your lawyer on them, right? That's what they did. They went and they're like, go find the lawyer, send him in. I wanted to tell a lawyer joke there so bad, but we have one in the audience, so I didn't want to do it. Right, Kev? Actually, he's got more of them than I do, so that's the funny part. So, yeah, they sicked their lawyer on Jesus. And what has he said? He says, which is the greatest commandment in the law? Let's talk about that just a moment as well, too. You see, by the time Jesus shows up on the scene and he's talking to these group of people 2,000 years ago, there were about 613 commandments on the books at this time. What had started with 10 had grown to 613. So I want to talk a little bit about the history on this, and I realize some of you are like, man, great, I love doing this, and some of you, your eyes have already begun to roll up to the back of your head. I get it. If you ever want to clear my wife out of a room, by the way, put on the History Channel. There will be fire on the trail on her way out of the room on that. I, on the other hand, love it. Some things we need to know about the law, because if you're going to read the New Testament, you're often going to hear references to the law. It can mean several different things, and so it can sometimes be a little bit confusing. When we refer to the law, we could be referring to the first 10 commandments, which was the basis of it. Sometimes it could be referred to the Mosaic law, which followed the 10 commandments, which was Moses using the 10 commandments as a foundation to define the life of these desert nomads on their way to the promised land and how they were going to live and do life together based on their interpretation of these laws. There is also the ceremonial and temple laws, which defined how they were going to worship and what they were going to wear and what kind of objects were in the temple and what it looked like, just all sorts of things. There were ceremony temple laws as well. There was also rabbinical laws on top of that, which were laws added over the course of the next few hundred years that they just got to that 613 number. Ultimately, they could just be referring as the laws the first 5 books of the Bible, which is the Torah, called the books of the law. And you say, well, that's really confusing. Yeah, it got confusing for them too. And that was part of the problem, is they're being held to these set of laws, and it's impossible. In doing so, it had enslaved them in many ways, because they had added on. What had started with 10 had now become 613. I love Jesus' response, though, to the question. In Matthew 22, verse 37, he says this. Jesus replied, "Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind. This is the first and greatest commandment." In this verse, Jesus is quoting Deuteronomy 6:4, part of the first 5 books of the Bible. This is also part of, they would have known this verse because it was part of what they called the Shema, which is part of a prayer that they say in their morning worship and in their evening worship every single day. So they would have known exactly what Jesus is saying. And the Shema, it starts like this. "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and all your strength." Jesus was quoting this very important prayer and verse and saying this is the first and the greatest commandment. And I love that he starts with love. You see, because we started this conversation several weeks ago wanting to look at the 10 Commandments a little bit differently. All too often, we're tempted to look at them as a list of rules and obligations we have to follow to get God off of our back. But I've asked us to look at them differently, to understand that these were given in a covenant with Israel, that they are vows that define the covenant love, that they are promises made in love. The 10 Commandments, in many ways, are like wedding vows. They define what this loving relationship between God and the people of Israel, God's people, was going to look like. They're not obligations. They're not rules. When I make vows to my wife, I didn't do it because I had to be obligated to love her. I did it to define what that love was going to look like, what that relationship was going to look like. When I made vows to my wife, I said, there's not going to be any more wives before you. You're going to be my only wife. I said that I'm not going to look at images of other women as well, whether those are images on the TV screen or on the computer screen or on the phone or in a strip club. I'm not going to look at other women. That when I speak of your name and use your name, I'm going to use it in a way that respects the dignity and the love we have together. That in our marriage, we're going to carve out time to be together, to focus on you, for us to do life together. That it's important that we carve that time out each week. I'm going to respect authority because marriage is about submitting. I'm not going to harm you. I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to cheat on you. I'm not going to steal from you. And I'm going to be content with the life we live. It's not rules. It's not obligations. They're vows made in love. At a mountain where God says, I will be your God, you will be for me my people. They are promises made in love, just like wedding vows. And so you notice that this prayer starts with, love the Lord your God with all your heart. The law is founded on love, not obligation. Your relationship with God is founded on love, not rules. We are in a covenant relationship with that God that says, I won't do anything to break that bond of love we have. Jesus continues in Matthew 22, verse 39. He says, and the second one is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And notice what he says. All the law and the prophets hang on these two commands. Interesting. All of the law and the commandments hinge on these two things. Jesus is summarizing the entire law, all of the commandments. He's summarizing our relationship with him by two things. Love God and love others. Everything about your relationship with God, everything about your Christian journey, everything about your walk, everything you do, everything you say, everywhere you go is based on these two principles. We are called to love God and we are called to love others. All of the law and all of the prophets get down and hinge on these two things. But maybe you're saying, well, wait a minute. We just spent an entire series talking about 10 of them. What do you mean? It comes down to two things. Well, even in the 10 Commandments, we see that. Because the first 4 deal with our relationship directly with God, don't they? There's one God, no idolatry, don't use his name in vain, honor the Sabbath. All of those define the relationship, a loving relationship with God. And the other 6 then define how we love others. If I love you, I'm not going to steal from you, am I? I'm not going to lie to you. I'm not going to murder you. I'm not going to hurt you. Even built into the 10 Commandments is this very idea of love God and love others. Everything can be summarized to those two things. And that's the challenge you're being called to live in your life. Our journey with God can be summarized by these two things. And you say, well, that's pretty easy. No, we really seem to have a hard time with both of them. For whatever reason. You say, what does it mean to love God with all your heart? How do we love others the same way? What does that look like? What does love look like in this crazy, chaotic world we live in? And as I stick through that this week, I'm reminded once again of a wedding ceremony. Most of us in this room have probably been to a wedding ceremony or two in our lives. There's one passage of Scripture that often gets read, sometimes more often than others, and you're probably familiar with it. You've probably heard this, and when they said it in the wedding service, you've probably nodded your head and said, that's nice. That's really cool, It's 1 Corinthians 13. Verse 4, it says, love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. It does not boast. It's not proud. Here's a big one. It does not dishonor others. Whatever their color, whatever their background, whatever their religious affiliation, no matter who they are, where they've been, what they've done, love does not dishonor others. It is not self-seeking. It is not easily angered. It doesn't keep a record of wrongs. Love does not delight in evil, but it rejoices in the truth. It always protects. It always trusts. It always hopes. And it always perseveres. Love never fails. Here's the problem, though, after we read that. Now, take that verse and apply it to Charlottesville and to what happened in Spain this week, and what does it mean now? Right? So there's the easy kind of love, but what happens when the rubber hits the road? What happens when the heat gets turned on? What happens when it gets personal? What happens when this thing is done to you? What happens when that person says that thing to you that's hurtful? What happens when they do that thing that destroys you? What now? Now what does it mean to love God and to love others? It's difficult, but yet we are called to love God no matter what. Which gets us to our so what moment. Asked a question earlier, and I want to ask it again as we kind of wrap the 10th commandment back into this whole idea and loving God and loving others. A few of the questions I looked at is, how's your heart doing? Is there something aching in there? Is there something keeping you from the life God has in store for you? Check your heart. But more importantly, I want to ask that question we asked earlier. What's robbing you of your freedom? What's keeping you from being that person you were created to be? What's keeping you from loving God and loving others as you were created to? What are you holding on to? Maybe it's greed. Maybe it's selfishness. Maybe there's a hurt, there's a pain. Maybe it's something more real. Maybe you have an addiction. Maybe it's alcohol. Maybe it's drugs. Maybe you struggle with depression. Maybe there's somebody you need to forgive, but you just can't seem to find it in your heart to forgive them. What's that thing keeping you from a life of freedom? Because if we're going to be the people that make a difference in the world around us, if we're going to be a church that charges the hill, if we're going to be a group of people who are dedicated passionately to introducing people to Jesus, whatever it takes and wherever God sends us, we're going to have to be people who live in the freedom that God is calling us to live in. We're going to have to check our hearts. We're going to have to find those things that need to be worked on. We're going to have to repent them, which means we're just going to have to admit them and own it. We got to give it to God. What's that thing that's keeping you from freedom? So here's what I want you to do. In front of each of your chairs, except maybe on the front row here, but in front of each of your chairs, you've got a Post-it note sitting there. I want everybody to grab that Post-it note from in front of you real quick. If you don't have one, you can raise your hand and the ushers are coming down the aisle and they can get you one. We'd be glad to get you one. If you need a pen, you can raise your hand as well too. They're coming down the aisle now. I want everybody to grab that piece of paper. Here in the next few minutes as Weston just plays on the keyboard. Without looking around at your neighbor and talking or anything, I want you to just spend a moment asking yourself, what's keeping me from the freedom? What's robbing my joy? What's robbing my generosity? What's robbing my contentment? What's that thing in my life that's in the way? And I want you to write it down on this piece of paper. Later on, as we take the offering, some black buckets are going to go by. And I want everybody to just place that in the bucket. But I want you to take about 30, 45 seconds real quick and write it down. What's that thing that's robbing you of your freedom? Do that now.